Hello everyone, and welcome to all of you both watching this live as a webinar and watching this on YouTube later or on the LINX website. It is my great pleasure today to introduce today's speaker, Geoff Huston, and he will be presenting as part of LINX's Distinguished Speakers series. We are rolling out a series of speakers with experts in the industry who have a unique perspective and who will be presenting over the coming months. All of this will be available and is available on the LINX website, so check the other speakers out as well. And so without further ado, I will introduce Geoff Huston, who is the Chief Scientist at EuroDiG, where he undertakes research on topics associated with internet infrastructure, IP technologies, and address distribution policies. From 1995 to 2005, Geoff was the Chief Internet Scientist at Telstra, where he provided a leading role in the construction and further development of Telstra's internet service offerings, both in Australia and as part of Telstra's global operations. Prior to Telstra, Mr. Huston worked for the Australian National University, where he led the initial construction of the internet in Australia in the late 1980s as the technical manager of the Australian Academic and Research Network. He's the author of a number of books on IP technology and has authored numerous papers and columns. He served on the board of the Public Internet Registry and also on the Executive Council of EuroDiG. He chaired the Internet Engineering and Planning Group from 1992 to 2005. In 2020, Geoff has been awarded Member of the Order of Australia, and he's also an inductee into the Internet Hall of Fame. And with us today, here with us today, and he will be speaking about technology adoption in the internet. So welcome again, and Geoff, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Narani. I don't know about you, but here in Australia, it's all kind of black and dark, and that's sort of dull. It's certainly dull as a background. So what I've decided is to share with you a trip I did exactly this time last year in Mongolia. And behind me is the War Memorial, a gift from the Russian people to the Mongolian people, celebrating something very medieval. I'm not sure what they did in Mongolia at the time, but you know, after Genghis Khan, I'm not sure they went through the medieval era. I think they destroyed it. Anyway, yes, that's Ulaanbaatar. Great place to visit if you can ever get there, if we ever travel again. But on to other things. Look, today I'd actually like to talk about a topic that's been, I suppose, bugging me for years, almost the last 3 decades of my life. And you'll see why in a second. So what we'll do is talk about the topic of how do technologies get adopted in the internet? What's the process? And when we look at new technologies, how do we judge whether they're going to work or not? I'd certainly be happy to make this as interactive as possible. So if you have comments as I go along, or you feel mortally offended, by all means, pop it in the Q&A and Narani will interrupt me or something, and we'll try and address them on the fly. But certainly happy to take questions as we go. You don't need to hang on to your burning issue to the end. So yes, if you feel so inclined, speak at once. There are also happy talks and provocative talks, and possibly even depressing talks. On the scale of happy to, oh God, we're about there on this talk. So be warned, this is not all sweetness and light. There are a few very grim messages going on, but we'll get to them. You know, it's always been a mystery to me, and possibly to you. I'm not sure we ever even understood at the time where the marketing department lived. And for IPv4, I'm not sure there was one. It just took off. It was a runaway success. And within a very small number of years, demand far exceeded the industry's capability of supply. No matter how much we built in the mid-90s onwards, no matter how quickly we redeployed capital, we put in bandwidth, we put in routers, we put in infrastructure, no matter how quickly we worked, it was never fast enough. There was always more demand. But V6, I mean, it's now getting close to 3 decades, and it's still kind of waiting in the wings. No one could get away in a production environment out there in the public internet of running a V6 only service yet. So 3 decades later, still waiting. We're in a transition. This transition is going to end ever. And if it is going to end, if we are going to get to a V6 only world, when? When is this going to stop? Because in some ways, this technology is stalling. And indeed, you know, the alternate theory of V6 transition is this is reality. What we have now is where it ends. It's already ended. And this dual stack mess that we're in today, and this endless, I suppose, confusion for a lot of internet service providers, and this whole issue around dual stacking and NATs and all that is the mess we're just going to have to live with for as long as what we call the internet still works. And the end result is it will be the internet itself that crumbles into chaos and something else happens rather than a V6 net. You know, that's plan B. And grim as it sounds, this might be the plan we're living. It's hard to tell. So there's this sort of question about why did one technology work, V4 just went off, and the other one's sort of sitting there going, grind, grind, grind. And it's such a long, slow, hard process. But of course, I shouldn't just sort of talk about V6 and say, well, that's the only example. The internet holds together itself using the Border Gateway Protocol, BGP. Wonderful protocol, 65 years old. Seriously, 65 years. Long before we ever started building large-scale networks, we talked about autonomous self-discovering networks and what was actually called Bellman-Ford, which originally was invented by neither Mr. Bellman nor Mr. Ford. To give credit where credit's due, go look up Mr. Google to find out who did it. It's a very, very old routing protocol, but that's the protocol that glues the internet together. It creaks, it groans. You can hear the wheels turning. 65 years old. Have we had better ideas? Surely we must have been able to figure out how to do a better job at routing than BGP. BGP doesn't do a whole bunch of things. Traffic engineering, alternate path selections, rapid response. You know, none of this stuff is part of BGP, but that's what we use. Well, that's not the only example. And again here, TCP, wow. 1980 odd, 1981, I think, the TCP flag day. HTTP, certainly more recent as 1990. Yeah, right. The DNS, well, again, 80s. SMTP, well, 80s. So we don't actually do anything these days. None of these fundamental protocols have actually changed. We actually spend all of our time either tweaking around the edge or spending time avoiding actually making any basic changes. No, we can't do that. It's all too dangerous. We don't know what we're doing. We'll break something. And so we actually seem to be stuck in a rut, and not just a recent rut, a rut that's now decades old. So what can we talk about when we talk about technology adoption in the internet? I'm like, is there any space even left? Is there any new area that we could actually do some incredible technical innovation? Or is the internet itself now getting to the point where it's just sclerotic dotage? You know, I just can't do anything at all, not because there isn't good ideas. What we have is way, way less than perfect. You know, every single time there's a DDoS attack using UDP, you sort of think, why are we still doing it this way? Why aren't we doing any kind of filtering on forged source addresses? What is this story about security? What we have is way, way worse than perfect. But we're not changing anything. We're incredibly slow. It's almost as if the beast, which at one time we said was agile, certainly the story in the 90s was Unlike OSI, this is a protocol that moves and changes and is adopted quickly. It's an open protocol. Lots of folk are interested. It changes. It's continuously evolving. None of that is true today. Absolutely none. You could actually say, and I'm pretty sure, you know, it's been said and will be said again, the internet actually resists change actively. The process of actually changing anything at all is incredibly hard in today's internet. Extremely hard. And most of the protocols we're using are now decades old, not because we haven't got better ideas, and not even because those decades old protocols are perfect. They're not, far from it. But we just can't seem to make any changes here. So why? Now, there was this wonderful analysis that was done for the New York Times by Nicholas Fenton in 2005, republished in the Harvard Business Review. And it's actually a study of consumer technology adoption in US households across basically the 20th century. And there are some wonderful tracks there. We always talked about the telephone being a runaway success, but as a household, not a business, but as a household device, the Depression, you know, everything about the telephone took forever. It wasn't until the 80s that telephones in homes were ubiquitous. Clothes washers, almost any technology that relied on the females in the house seemed to take longer than the males. Gee. None of these technologies were fast. Now, the point that Nicholas Fenton was trying to make was the internet's been really quick. Look at that, Zoom, the cell phone, Zoom, computers, Zoom, even VCRs, whereas previously, these technologies took a huge amount of time to actually get adopted. And he was trying to make the point that in the modern world of 2005, we are much more prone to adopt technologies quickly. Consumption spreads far more rapidly than throughout most of the 20th century. But there's something else about that graph. And it's almost the issue that there is inevitability. It's almost the clothes washer, which is the one that actually resisted the change, that by about 1939, wonder what was happening, the consumption, the use of clothes washers actually fell for the next few years, and it didn't pick up again until 1946, 47. But the rest of the time, it was almost like the railway tracks. It was just going to happen. And there's this conventional view of progress in technology. And I think actually in our heads, we all believe it. We really do. Tomorrow will be better than today. And over time, everything gets faster, everything gets better, and everything gets cheaper. That's what we think. And almost that's why as consumers, we react. And the process is actually one of progressive refinement. I start at point A, I refine that to point B, I build to point C, and so on. And even when I was down at the bottom of this track, I can chart the future because faster, better, cheaper is inevitable, isn't it? We're just going to do things better over time. And one of the best examples about this I can bring up is actually the phenomenal story of the IEEE's work on gig Ethernet. The original 10 megabit Ethernet, which on this 2016 roadmap is somewhere down there in the early 90s. And this progression to 100, to a gig, to 5 gig, etc., is charted out so that by the time they built this little infographic in 2016, at 200 gig, they're already going 400, easy, 800, easy, 1.6 terabits, yeah, 2020. Deterministic, just it's going to happen. This view of technology adoption as being, it's not a discussion, it's a process, and the process is inevitable. And so even now, when we look at the same roadmap today, you can actually see they've changed the analogy. It's not a car, it's not a road now, it's actually some reason a dial, but yes, 10 gig, 200 gig, 400 gig, 800 gig. And the times may have shifted slightly, but it's still much the same idea that this is all just a matter of time. Things are going to get faster. You will notice that physics is getting in the way of fiber and photons. And in the 4 years since they first did 1.6 terabits, the next roadmap in 2020 is kind of stopped there. It's sort of, oh, not sure how we're going to do more than that. But nevertheless, the guys in the lab are still overachieving. I saw an announcement, I think it was yesterday, of someone doing 178 terabits through fiber. Oh my God. So, you know, this is technology adoption as inevitable, as a process that is progressive, refined, that builds on itself and just gets better. You know, I think it's the exception. I think it totally is. Yeah, there's that. The rest of the world, because I'm not even sure what these axes are. It's sort of something and something else. And over time, we seem to just jump around in random states. It's chaos. We actually have no long-term objective. We just randomly move from state to state most of the time and just flick around in random directions because, you know, it's a Thursday. I've got nothing better to do today. And that sort of seems to be the way it's doing. That this process is almost like biology. Random changes happen in the genetic code. In biology, of course, natural selection says, well, that's a good change. That's rubbish. But I don't think technology has a clear analog of that filter. And sometimes completely broken technologies gain market ascendancy, even if only for a short time. Anyone remember WAP? You have to go back to the 90s, but oh my God, it was awful. But it was around for a couple of years and the telcos just fell in love with it. So sometimes completely broken technologies, just daft, stupid ideas gain market ascendancy for no clear reason. And sometimes we accidentally make good choices for perhaps all the wrong reasons, but, you know, seemed good at the time. And oddly enough, history said, yeah, good move. But it wasn't really thought out. It was just random. Because, you know, realistically, we can't decide on the same thing at the same time. I think I'm like the UK. I'm on a system with 240 volts coming out of the wall. If any of us are ever going to get to America again on aeroplanes, you know, it will happen eventually, I guess. That won't work. It's 110 volts. There's 50 hertz versus 60 hertz. And if you go to Japan and move around from north to south and east to west, you're going to find all of these different systems of power in various parts of the country. Of course, if you ever need to fuel power from the north to the south because of, say, a massive earthquake or a tsunami, it ain't going to happen because the volts are different. And more importantly, the hertz are different. Oops. Even something simple like driving a vehicle, left, right, left, right. Oh no, let's just do both. You do left, I'll do right. Yeah, right. So, okay, we can't do this. Even in telephony, when we started digitizing voice and looked at the various mechanisms to actually get most of the analog richness of voice into 64 kilobits of some kind of pulse-coded modulation, there were two coded laws that tried to put the fine-grained modulation of the encoding into the bits that made speech audible and distinguishable. The Americans went A-law. Everyone else, mu law. So when you did a telephone call, remember those telephone calls from anywhere to America, it actually went through a mu law to analog to A-law encoding every single call, every single time. And when you were doing circuit provisioning, like Europe, Australia went through the E multiplexing. Japan and the US, no, the T multiplexing. Different digital hierarchy because of a different underlying signaling technique inside these common bearers. Now, wasn't one better than the other? No, they were just different. Why? Cause. No reason. And you get back into the computing world. And if you go back not too far to the mainframes of the late 70s, early 80s, you found all kinds of bizarre ideas from the old EBCDIC 6-bit word computer. 8 bits was kind of one contender. Digital made a huge line of 36-bit word computers. Why 36? I have no idea. And Control Data, if you remember them, came out with the 60-bit computer, which was obviously better than anyone else. But why? What's going on that each of them thought that this was the right answer, but no one could agree on anyone else's? And even today, if you do any kind of network coding, you immediately get hung up on the fact of big endian versus little endian. And folks still get it wrong. I remember doing some work looking at network 1, and we're looking at the incoming traffic that came into the address. We're advertising 1.0.0/8. In other words, every single prefix in the V4 space that started with 1 in the first octet. A huge amount of traffic was being sent to 1.0.0.10. Oh, you're meant to shovel the bytes around, aren't you? It was 10.0.0.1, but someone had forgotten big endian versus little endian. Why do we have big endian versus little endian? Because we can't agree. Why don't we agree? Now, some things kind of worked. Some things were success, almost despite this inability to agree. Some things were revolutionary. The packet switched model in IP simply took over. It wasn't perhaps the best way of doing things. It certainly wasn't the worst, but it gained ascendancy and widespread adoption because it was just revolutionary. The browser application smoothed over all those differences in platform and said, well, every browser, you can actually make the look and feel the same, no matter where you're running it and how you're running it. Even mobile devices, completely revolutionary through widespread adoption. And the same almost with social media. So some of these things have actually succeeded. And, here's just a couple. Circuits to packets. What was really transformational wasn't that packets are better than circuits. They weren't. Circuits, packets, what the hell? What was revolutionary was that I could actually put almost 100 times the content through a packet switch system as compared to a circuit switch system. Or to throw it the other way, a 100 times unit cost reduction. It was cheaper. It was so much cheaper. When we first started building the internet, the original NSF net was done on 56 kilobit circuits, one voice call circuit. Even the first big internet from the NSF was T1, 1.5 megabits, 20 odd circuits. So it wasn't that packets were better than circuits. It was the unit cost. The efficiency of packets was so much better that unit cost reduction was so great, it literally destroyed the telco. Circuits were just so expensive that they had to die. Interestingly, cloudware, everything happens in my server that I can touch and feel and lives in the machine room in the basement. We've gone to cloudware, but the reduction in cost from the server in the basement to the service on the cloud isn't that great. It's actually only a 2 to 4 time unit cost reduction for the amount of computing and storage. So that moderate change in unit cost has actually meant a moderate pace of change. So folks like IBM still exist as a company. Folk who make hardware, Intel and so on, who actually service a lot of this market still exist. Incumbents can ride the change when the cost reduction isn't so dramatic. Whereas, we've certainly seen failure. We've seen a lot of failure. Anyone of my vintage will remember OSI, not fondly. Some will remember ATM, not fondly. And SMS, the success disaster. This was the unintended success of the mobile network, that people really were wanting to use their thumbs and a numeric keypad to send tiny messages to each other. Runaway success. This was the thing that was going to save the telco until Twitter. Then all of a sudden, SMS, what's SMS? I use Twitter. And what's this sort of message limit in Twitter? Oh, it's an SMS thing. What's SMS? So, what actually happened to SMS? Disaster. And interestingly, IPv6, we thought the transition was going to be quick, really quick. 10 years? Nah, 5 at the best. Really fast. So they've failed in terms of the original intention here. And, failure still persists. I keep on hearing of folks saying, new IP, we'll take it to all the committees, and all the committees will say it's wonderful and it'll be adopted. Yeah, right. just doesn't work like that. So here's some sort of putting some examples up. In V6, why is it a failure example? Well, it doesn't make it cheaper. The incumbents don't feel any pressure to adopt. And 25 years later, it's still just going on. DNSSEC, it's harder, it's more expensive. There's no clear incremental benefit to the user. And this is this protracted transition, no end in sight. And I actually argue, oddly enough, that circuits to packets actually ended up being a failure, oddly enough. True stateless packet switch networks only exist in textbooks. Everyone else runs MPLS. What's MPLS? Virtual circuits. Why? Well, I suppose there are a myriad of reasons, and they still get the economies of packet switching, but virtual circuits just didn't go away. So this whole idea that packets were going to revolutionize, stateless packet switch networks were going to be the thing, ended up not. So why? Why do some of these things succeed and some are just train wrecks? Why is security a market failure? Why is Google in the center of our universe? It's so entrenched that it's hard to imagine what's going to disrupt its position. So why? Well, I suspect that there are some basic economics and market arguments. Incumbents love their incumbency, and that breeds risk aversion and increasing inertia. You saw it with the telco world, that increasingly over time, they became more and more risk averse and less prone to making changes. You see it in today's internet, less prone to making dramatic change. That is risk averse because incumbency breeds that. Now, what that also means is because they don't want to change, they try and stop others forcing them. So it breeds the erection of increasing barriers to market entry for competitors. I don't want to change, so your new product's going to make me change? Nah, if I can stop you, if I can buy you, if I can somehow destroy what you're doing, I'm a winner. So what that means is competitors can't succeed unless they're massive. And that actually means the cost of risk rises. So if you have a wonderful idea and you think I need venture capital, I'll get a slow boat to America, get the train across to Page Mill Road on the West Coast, and I'll get my new idea funded. Unless your idea is in the billions of dollars, don't bother, because the cost of risk is now so high that disruptive competition now and funding that through venture capital is a massive exercise because incumbents don't want change. So the market motivations are that incumbents fiercely resist change and drive the market to resist it. And what you actually find is, I suppose, this generalized model of the economics of innovation, because, and the scale is pretty arbitrary, but if I can do something that's, say, half the unit cost of what you're doing, you'll probably stop me. You'll certainly resist me because you're having a fine old time and all I'm doing is such a minor change that you could probably do it too, and I won't manage to have an edge on the market. But at some point, I do it so cheaply, you die. The incumbent gets replaced because it's just so irresistibly cheap. Now, I've kind of said that somewhere around 16 times or 32 times unit cost kind of gives you this overwhelming adoption pressure. Users want it. It's just so cheap, I've got to go there. But of course, over there far on the right, it gets so cheap that it's free. The market is destroyed. No one makes a buck. Now, those numbers at the bottom are actually relative. When monopolies take hold of a market, they entrench. And what that means is they increase the resistance to change. So to take on the telcos, we needed to be over 100 times cheaper in unit cost reduction. Anything less didn't work. Oddly enough, in open markets, where there is no entrenched monopoly, you actually find that it's a lot easier to tip the market to go in different directions. So the market resistance is actually almost a measure of the health of these markets, that open markets are far more accepting of change in incumbency, whereas once monopolies get entrenched, the only thing that gets rid of them is market destruction. Google, Facebook, Akamai, market destruction, because that's all that's left. So some examples here. Here's some measurements we've done at APNIC, slowly, carefully charting the progress of V6. The scale goes from 2014 until a few days ago. And as you see, there's no avalanche of success. This looks more like air conditioning in the US in the 20th century, slow and steady. And if I actually take a snapshot of Europe, and the reason why I took a snapshot of Europe is, in theory, with a common financial base, there's certainly some degree of commonality in theory in the market and the consumer's reaction to technologies. But even in this, one would assume, relatively uniform market, some countries have done a huge amount of work in V6. Germany, Belgium, even France, Greece, but up to the north, Sweden, nah. Spain, nah. Down south, Italy, nah. Massive divergency. Okay, so maybe it's something about those economies. Well, let's look at a different technology, DNSSEC. Slightly different. You might remember the role of the KSK, the key signing key. It turned a few people off for a little while, but we're back on a slow and steady grinding, growth in DNSSEC. Let's look at the map of Europe. Sweden, I'm there. Norway, totally. Finland, yes. France, mais non. The UK, no. And so on. So if I actually look at a bunch of these technologies, there's V6, there's DNSSEC, and I'm also looking at the adoption of secure routing of the RPKI route origin validation. It's all Europe, but different technologies are viewed differently by different operators. What? Why? Okay, this is not the telco world. This is not one player anymore, one vertically integrated player that defines the market, defines the product, defines what the consumer has. This is completely deregulated and highly competitive. Every single element of this market is now competitively positioned, and every player has their own perspective. So oddly enough, what that means is, for any particular group of technologies, everyone's going to go in different directions because they can, and they probably will. Secondly, the myth of long-term planning. I joined the Australian telco, Telstra. I was sold to them. The days of slavery weren't gone, in 1995. And at the time, they were doing their year 2K plan. And because they were telcos, they were very advanced. They'd started their Y2K plan in 1987. Now, there was this mythology that being a big telco and very important, they had to do long-term planning. You're right. Who does that anymore? In fact, if you sort of turn it back at yourself, do you remember the plans you had 5 years ago for your network service? Do you remember what your firm ideas were? Or if I say 5, what about 10 years? We don't do long-term planning. This industry is now completely reactive. So if we're faced with long-term transitions, DNSSEC, V6, even RPKI, then there's no roadmap that extends over the period of transition. It's random. And quite frankly, the risk of losing the plot and heading out elsewhere is just right there. So the challenge for adoption says, when you're dealing with a long-term process that takes many years, it's hard to understand that folk are going to come with you. And I suppose the last challenge, and almost the biggest, is that this is not the internet of 5 years ago. It's certainly not the internet of 10 years ago. And it's really not the internet of 30 years ago. It's not the 1980s internet. Today's internet architecture doesn't have transit. The only reason why we have exchanges, links, is to actually interface the access networks to the content data networks. It's a convenient way of aggregating content and getting maximal distribution with minimal latency. So today's internet architecture is just a bunch of content service cones. Why do I need global anything when there is no global network anymore? It's a different network. So inside that melange of different motivations, highly competitive positioning, and of course a changing environment, some providers see an advantage in just jumping early, because in competition, it may not be the right thing, but if I jump early, if it is the right thing, I'm a winner. So the risk takers, the entrepreneurial sort of inclined, would jump early, even if it might not be right. Because in some ways, if they are right, if this is a good move, they've got the jump. They'll have enhanced utility, they'll have enhanced familiarity. If it's more secure or safe, absolutely. They're there at the front door, they've got experience, they see some advantage. Others simply go, I don't know. V6, if you're feeling uncharitable, and let's go there, you could actually argue that it's the wrong technology for the wrong time. It's a 1980s networking architectural challenge for a 1990s technology. No one has permanent IP addresses anymore. Addresses don't matter in terms of the networking solutions that we use. We are a name-based network in reality, and that we borrow addresses, use them to communicate for our session, and then throw them back in the pool and someone else will use them. That's not what IPv6 was intended to do. It was a 1980s networking challenge of numbering every device permanently. Well, privacy addresses notwithstanding, because permanent addressing was indeed a big mistake. But even with privacy addressing and dynamic addressing at the edge, the whole idea was we numbered everything. And some providers would go, well, but it's wrong. It's not going to go anywhere. It's backwards looking. DNSSEC could actually make exactly the same difficult question, because it's not securing the DNS. It's a pantomime of securing the DNS. If you and I did DNSSEC validation down here in our end devices on these things, that's secure DNS. But what actually happens is somewhere out there, someone validates and sends me back an answer, unencrypted still most of the time, and sets a bit that says it's real. Well, anyone can set that bit. Why should I believe that? So why should you do DNSSEC when really isn't that secure? It's just the appearance of security without it. And when you look at trying to put keys in the DNS, which Dane tried, its demise is actually an example of the fact that we're not willing to have every device do DNSSEC. The DNS won't work if every device is trying to do validation at the edge. This is not a good idea, some would argue. An RPKI route origin validation, well, it's only the origin, it's not the path. And as many folk have pointed out, it's really easy to put a faked origin on a faked path. And so it looks good, the origin's fine, the path is completely wrong. The hijack's there, but RPKI protects you? Well, not really. And the problem is more moving parts introduces fragility and doesn't really make the operating stability greater. So in all of these technologies, you can make the case there are advantages for early adoption, that these are critical technologies and experience with them will give you a competitive edge. Others say, you're kidding. You are really kidding. This stuff is not what it needs to be. It's partial solutions. It's not the answer. Why shouldn't I just wait? Because you're going to have to do more. This isn't good enough. And that argument gets played out in our investment in infrastructure. These are decisions that aren't just debating points, they're money. Because this is a market like any other. And ultimately, it's consumers that make choices. And resisting this is, of course, the scale of the production machine. The bigger the volume of these systems, the greater the resistance in its inertia. Incumbency, as we talked before, actively resist change. Why should I change? I'm making money. All I have to do is hit my competitors on the head and make them go away, and I'll keep on making money and don't have to do anything. And so the emergence of these large-scale digital incumbents creates its own challenge. Because quite frankly, we're not communicating with each other anymore. We're communicating with, if you will, the digital world. And interestingly, the network itself is incidental. It's really about those changes that have created these massive engines of content computing, storage and comms. And underneath all that is an astonishingly small set of players. Now, you might say, well, that's really new. It's not. We've been there before. After fighting the first industrial age war in America between themselves, and they had so much fun, they turned that industrial capacity to industry in the Gilded Age in the late 19th century. And all of a sudden, that industrial capacity changed small-scale enterprises into massive giants. US Steel, with us today. Standard Oil, with us today. AT&T, something's still with us today that calls itself AT&T. Westinghouse, didn't they make ICBM missiles? I think they did. General Electric, didn't they also make big bombs? I think they did. And of course, JP Morgan, they're with us today. So oddly enough, these weren't fly-by-night companies. These were massive companies that exist more than a century later. They were so big, they dominated so much, they moved so quickly, the regulatory regime was sitting there going, who, what, where, how, why, what happened to us? And those monopolies took decades for the Americans to come to terms with. The Sherman Act and all the work around trying to dismember and produce realistic antitrust. And if you look at the vestiges of that antitrust mechanism and their ability to not engage with Microsoft, Europeans, can you help us? We can't manage that one. Google, well, what problem? Amazon, oh yeah, well, it's just shopping. So still what we have now is another Gilded Age. And quite frankly, the regulatory position is just as bad as it ever was. That this dominant position is just dominated by a small group of folk who just totally dictate their own terms and conditions. And their excesses are not curbed by any regulatory measure anywhere. And all they do these days is lobby to make sure that this doesn't change. Here's the federal lobbying spends by the biggies in 2017. Who spent the most? Google, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, Apple. Oh, what a surprise. And of course, now the real question is less about the technology, but about who's the incumbents that are actively resisting technology, that are making sure what they want prevails. So I said before that we're now communicating in this environment that's digital, but realistically, it's all about monopolies. And monopolies is actually what dictates change in this world. And as Andrew Jackson said a long time ago, 190 years, every time you get a monopoly and all those exclusive privileges, it's the public interest that pays. And so what we're seeing with Google is not about competition today. As was pointed out in a remarkable script in Chinatown, 1974. And I think it was referring to the Gilded Age, but it's equally apt today. So what we're really buying, or what those are really buying, is the future and the technology of the future. They're making sure their incumbency echoes for decades. Now, this gets really worrying or incredibly empowering. Google has won more pub arguments than you'd ever believe, because all of a sudden the entire world's knowledge is sort of sitting here. This is incredibly empowering. It's an amazing piece of technology, but at the same time, it's really threatening. It's incredibly worrying at the same time, because I don't think this technology argument is all about a better internet. I actually don't think it's anything about the internet anymore. We have moved way beyond the network. And you know, the internet, for whatever it was, has already died and gone to Silicon Heaven. I always loved that episode. If you've ever not seen it, and some of you might not have seen it, go dig it up on Google or YouTube or whatever. It's worth it. We've been here before. We'll do it again. Oddly enough, at some point, the internet will, and whatever comes after it, will descend into chaos. And again, you know, the great things in the world will die eventually. One of the seminal works on the rise and fall, the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, was authored centuries ago, 1776, by Edward Gibbon. And that mighty 6-volume work is still quoted today. It is the reference study of the decline and fall of a mighty empire. And the interesting observation was the seeds of its decline and fall were evident very early in its rise. And I suspect inside the internet itself is the same message, that those seeds of its own ultimate descent into chaos and something else happening after are already with us. We just don't know which ones they are. So is this about technology adoption? Well, to an extent, but I'm not sure it's really relevant at the moment. The real issue is, how do we actually accommodate and come to terms with our world and the extent and the speed and the rapidity at which a number of players have exploited that and made the rest of us almost into digital slaves. And somehow we need to get out of that mess. Will technology save us on that? I don't think so. I think the debate is far more at fundamental levels about how do we determine ourselves, how we have a conversation with these folk, and how we come to terms with the future that we should be building together and not having it built almost against us. Thank you. Questions?
So thank you very much for that, Geoff. I woke up this morning in a rather good mood. I had 2 cups of coffee. Now I'm not so sure anymore.
I tried to warn you, we're over at that end of the scale.
And we were rather uplifted last week because we had Jari Arko, who you know has been involved with the IETF for many years, talking about how the internet has actually evolved to meet new needs in the community and in the public, and how it will continue to carry us into the future. But now I'm not so sure anymore. So I will allow people to throw a few questions in the Q&A, but before you do so, or while people are thinking, I'm going to throw a few questions at you. So, well, coming back to what you were saying about the market, and you were talking about what drives the market is really the needs of the users. And if I understand you correctly, you're saying that's also why we don't have widespread deployment of IPv6 or DNSSEC or anything else, because the user doesn't actually care what underlying technology they're using as long as their needs are met.
Well,
but
this is, yeah.
No, so, well, I'm wondering if it's a false argument, because to use the market as sort of the solution to drive internet evolution forward. We've said the market will solve things, and it's also been an argument against monopoly, but look where we are today, and you're in fact saying that now we're back to sort of a monopolistic state, and we're not actually managing to adopt new technology. Were we wrong in using that argument, or are we thinking about it the wrong way?
You know, that's such a good question. And there is this sort of pendulum of thought that we lived for almost 100 years under the tyranny of the state enterprise monopoly that was the telephone company. And that telephone company almost created a business out of suppressing technology. Most of the sort of work that we base the internet on was actually produced in the labs of the telephone companies, but never deployed, because that monopoly was going, I really don't want to change my business model. And the floodgates that opened when we opened up telephony to competition and said, well, we don't believe that this one incumbent knows everything. We will expose the telephone market and the underlying communications market to market-driven competition, opened up opportunities for other players, entrepreneurs, to enter the market and create goods and services that people wanted. And people bought them, seductive, beautifully engineered. Everyone has one because it worked for them. They made their own decisions about what they wanted, and they wanted data. They wanted the internet. So it was a market-driven response. It was the success of markets. That markets through, you know, Adam Smith's invisible hand, producers were producing goods that consumers wanted to pay for. Perfect. But, you know, markets are not perfect. Markets fail. And there are many ways of market failure, from straight out fraud and manipulation to more subtle forms of failure. It is the sheerest folly for any public enterprise to simply think that after having deregulated a market, they can walk away and bravely cheer. It's all wonderful. We're making lots of taxation money. Let's go for it. Because the residual responsibility is to actually ensure that the market itself is open to competition, open to innovation, open to change. And what we're finding, of course, is that dominance of a few small players is so absolute that the ability of the public interest to express a failure in the market and to say, well, maybe this is not where we should be, is almost ineffectual. And it's ineffectual for two reasons. One, the enormous amount of money being spent on our politicians to convince them that there is no problem. Honestly, there is no need to intervene. Life is peachy. Go away. We're doing just fine. That's the first reason, I suppose, why. The second is actually we have gutted our public accountability, our public administration. There isn't the skills there anymore. You know, because we deregulated, because the public regulatory function wasn't regarded as necessary, we started releasing all those people. We never recruited. We didn't actually give it the degree of prominence in our society that it deserved. So when faced with a really tough problem, and just there on this slide is a really tough problem, nothing happens. It's a failure. And so the result is the circumstances of the market created market failure. And then we weren't left with the tools to try and salvage the problem and haul ourselves out of the hole that's been dug. We're deep down in that hole.
I have a comment from Dinesh. I have a few just great comments about it being a fascinating talk and a brilliant presentation, but I'll stop the flattery and I'll move on to Dinesh, who says that it seems to me that the new frontier from a few decades ago has quickly morphed into standard business model. The whole dynamism of the industry that we said we compared to telcos, and we are becoming like those old telcos. But then I'll make that into a question then. So what is the, I mean, if you say that it's about the consumer needs and you know, you might find this problematic, or we might find that there are some challenges in the internet. Is there a problem then? If the consumers are happy, maybe there's not a problem. Or could you not just argue that, well, maybe the internet will break and then the consumers will abandon it and we'll find something, we'll find new pretty toys to play with that's not the internet?
Narani, you could have been telling me the same thing when I put the spear of accusation into the heart of the telephone companies in the mid-80s. People have phones. Phones are cheap. They call everyone. What else would you do with a phone other than speak down it? Everyone has one. We have ubiquitous telephone service. You can dial anywhere in the world. You can call your mum, you can call your kid. What's the problem? And, you know, the answer really is, it's not enough. We actually can do more, and we should do more. Why? Because we do want to know more, to understand more. We actually do appreciate having the world's knowledge at our fingertips. But to say that that's enough is much the same as the head of the US Patent Office in the, I've forgotten the year, 1880 or something, who declared that the US Patent Office should be shut down because everything that was worth inventing has been invented. Nothing more to do. Goodbye and good night. That's just wrong. And it's wrong now as it was then. That to try and insist that the monopolists have given us perfection and we should appreciate that and stay inside our gilded cage and enjoy ourselves and not look further is just so wrong. It's so wrong on many levels. So no, I can't agree with that. And I can't agree with the idea that the incumbent view that, well, we're doing just fine. Why should we change? None of these technologies are proven yet. We shouldn't experiment with them. We shouldn't upset the apple cart. We shouldn't bring in entrepreneurs. We shouldn't encourage ventures. It's just so totally, I suppose, hostile to where my mindset is, that the most exciting times in our world and in our lives is actually times of change, times when we're challenged, times when we think, I can't do that, and then find that there are ways of doing things, times to think about problems in new ways. And God knows we have enough problems to think about. And to think that the old ways are good enough, that what we've got from these folk is enough, is so totally totally wrong. Well, that's what I think. I see a question from Dinesh that says, what should we as an industry do? And I think the issue is, my internet's dead or your internet's dead. So what should we as an internet industry do, Dinesh? Make it better. Interesting though, we should challenge ourselves. We should actually refuel the NRENs as true ventures. We should actually be open to risk. We should be encouraging risk rather than simply thinking, well, the market's going to cure all these ills. There is actually a public sector role. There is a role for research. There is a role for making adventures and entrepreneurial activities into this market and deliberately disrupt. Because it could work. It could change things for the better. Yeah, it's a venture. It might fail, but that doesn't mean it will definitely fail. It could work. And if it works, oh my God, a bit like the internet, an accidental success happens yet again. So, you know, what should we do? Be bold, be adventurous, actually make the ventures riskier, challenge the incumbency rather than simply going, it's enough.
Well, I think Narani's just struggling there. We do have a question in the chat. So question to you, Geoff. Still got a few problems with you, Narani. Question, who would have the opportunity to dissect it in time that technologies like IPv6, DNSSEC and RPKI would eventually become failures as you present them today? Who should have done something to prevent those failures, and what actions, for instance?
You know, that's a really interesting question. And I think the IETF was so drunk on its success with V4, so enamored with the idea that a partial solution would be fixed up after they'd actually published the RFCs, that the industry would take this rough diamond and polish it and make it better, that they got lazy, that they started pushing out technologies way too quickly. They stopped thinking and started into the RFC publication business. We started offering bonuses for employees because they published an RFC, not because they published a good one, they just published one. And the IETF got into being the thing we despised from the OSI area, a paper factory, an RFC factory. And we stopped actually analysing and listening to researchers and actually doing the hard yards in actually understanding the technology and trying to make it work. And we just started to push out stuff that was half-baked. DNSSEC got pushed out because after 10 years, everyone said, let's just publish and be damned and move on with our lives. Perhaps the worst possible answer, because it really isn't the right thing. Even V6, we're so wrapped up around V6 that we've actually not seen that the entire internet has changed, that we are a name-based network rather than an address-based network. And that technology adoption has been unconscious. And the protocols that make a name-based networking work are fundamentally different to ones about addressing. What's the answer here that would let us scale further to accommodate a different world that actually has a bigger population of devices in different modes of communication? How do we accommodate the content data networks of this world? Because it's not V6. That's not the technology that would hit that target. So in some ways, the pressure to reproduce the success of V4 made the IETF, I think, narrow-minded and started pushing out technologies that, you know, in the fullness of time, I think we could actually say were immature, uncooked.
Okay, so I can see that there are lots of interesting questions actually in the chat, and I see that we're just coming to a point where the discussion's getting interesting. And where we're looking at, people are asking, where do we go from here? How do we actually solve this? And what can different players do to fix some of these things? And I want to put that to you, Geoff, but before I do so, I wanted to throw some of those messages that came out of the EuroDiG discussion that actually started this discussion about technology adoption in the internet that made you write this article. And what I found interesting was to see some of the messages that came out of that and the conclusions they came to. So what they concluded was that part of the problem was that the tech community was unwilling to make an effort. And we need to create pressure points in society to spur development. Another thing they said was that we need to make these security holes in the transport layers visible to end users through education. And also we need to look at political tools of pressure like legislation. So those are all very interesting ideas, and I'd be interested to hear your response to that and also the questions in the chat. So what do we actually do practically going forward?
Well, thanks, Narani. That's a big question. I think part of this is it's great that we're unwilling to accept the status quo as something we've just got to live with, that we don't like it, and that where we are is far from where we want to be, both in the near and long term. So there does need to be some change in the way we view this. Now, putting our faith in markets hasn't been enough. Accusing the technologists of being the problem seems somewhat bizarre from the public sector, when in fact, it's as much a failure in the public sector, in my view, as it is a failure in terms of technology, that we've allowed this entrenched monopoly to have such a stranglehold. But I have to say, above all that, objective truth really isn't part of this conversation. It's actually a bunch of opinions. And what you've heard at some length is my personal opinion. And I admit it's an extreme one and it's strongly held, but that doesn't make it necessarily the only opinion or you know, heaven forbid, the truth. There are many, many other views in this area. And I think through discussion and through contrast and dialogue, you might actually get a better picture of what things might work for us in this circumstance and what may not. So that's the best answer I can offer, that my own opinion says yes, but I admit it's just one amongst possibly many.
That's a great answer. I mean, I think it's all about finding not necessarily the absolute truth, but to stumbling forward together by discussing and learning from each other. And in fact, this leads us really naturally onto another announcement I wanted to make, and that was that we will be holding a panel discussion on this very topic, so that others, apart from Geoff, can share their perspectives, and hopefully we'll hear a variety of views on this. On the 22nd of October, 2020, and we'll have Andrew Sullivan, who's the CEO of ISOC. We'll have Casey Claffey, who is the CEO and founder from Kaida. Geoff, of course, and also Yali Arko, who's former IETF chair, long-standing member or active member of the IETF community. And I think the four of you will provide an interesting range of perspectives on the topic. So I'd like to invite everyone to join that discussion as well. And with that, I can guarantee, Narani, we won't all be agreeing all of the time. Well, that's a great thing, and hopefully at least we'll be more informed in the end, and perhaps we might even reach some agreements in the end. Who knows? But with that, I'd like to say a big thank you, Geoff, for offering to give your interesting talk as part of the LINX Distinguished Speaker Series. Thanks again to everyone who's called in and listened to this, and for all of you watching this later as well on the LINX website, on YouTube. It's been a real pleasure listening to and participating in this webinar. So thank you to all, and hope to see you soon again. Thank you, Geoff. Thank you.